Hello and welcome to Sustain, where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? I'm Richard, your podcast host today. Solo hosting, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. And I'm joined today by a guest, Dirkjan Ochtman. Dirkjan, how are you doing today?
Pretty good.
Calling from Utrecht in the Netherlands. It is great to have you here. Now, Dirkjan is joining us for this podcast along with a few people over the course of May, where we celebrate Maintainer Month. May Maintainer, only got that last night. I should have gotten that a long time ago. But basically the idea is let's talk about maintainers and what it's like to maintain open source projects at the moment. These podcasts have been sponsored by GitHub, and I am excited to be able to record them because of that. Thank you, GitHub, for doing that. Dirkjan is a professional software engineer. He's been that since 2007, so he's seen some things, mostly in smaller companies. He was active in open source since before that for PHP, Mercurial, and Python, and he started using Rust in 2016 and has since probably rewritten everything because that's what happens in Rust, right? That's the joke. He gets paid for OSS maintenance right now on projects like Rustls, Hickory DNS, Quinn, and others. His bio actually says, here's a more complete list, go there. So clearly you do a lot of things, Dirkjan. Tell me about overall, how do you choose which projects you're maintaining?
I'm excited about Rust, right? And Rust means memory safety and good type systems. And so one thing that motivates me is just to work on replacing, let's say, older projects that implemented something in a way that was more fragile with the robustness that comes with Rust. And so Rustls is a TLS implementation, and obviously for TLS being the world's, I think, most commonly used security protocol, and that's really helpful. DNS is another really important part of internet infrastructure. And so having that be safer and not subject to a stream of vulnerabilities would also be quite useful. And Quinn, so that's a quick implementation. So back in 2018, I got off a job and I decided to do a talk at RustFest in Paris. And I wanted to do a cool project. And so I tried to implement the then new quick protocol, which promised to be a faster, more secure way, a more modern way to do internet communications. And so these are the kinds of projects that I sort of highlight projects that I do. And then I also often pick up projects that I use, like little Rust libraries that end up being inactively maintained. And sometimes I will email a maintainer for a project that I use if there's something to improve and say, hey, do you want to get rid of your project and hand it over so it will continue to be maintained? And I've done that a bunch of times.
So you're consciously choosing to maintain abandonware. That's like rare. Most of the time people are like, please get it away from me, get it away from me.
I mean, you call it abandonware and I call it, that dependency that has a zillion users, but a maintainer who has, other things to do. And so as sort of a service to myself and also the rest of the community, I think it's worth doing mostly passive maintenance, right? So I've gotten pretty good at code review. So I just do code review for any small PRs that come in and do like dependency upgrades and stuff like that. And I think that's useful value.
I would agree. Previously on this podcast in episode 108, I had Sarah Gran and Josh Asson. We talked about memory safe code. So they work for Let's Encrypt, Proximo, and Divvy Up for the Internet Security Research Group. And this group of people are dedicated towards basically rewriting stuff in Rust, right? So memory safe languages are more secure. They build a better internet. And so there's some people out there who allocate funding to make sure that important modules could be rewritten so that the internet as a whole is more safe. Are they the kind of people who pay you? Like, how do you get money to do this sort of work?
Yes. So the ISRG, through their Proximo project, has in fact been paying me to do that stuff. And so that started a few years back when I worked on a project to make Rustls more robust. I tried to eliminate panicking. So basically where it crashes because there's some fault condition arises. And like I solved that by make better use of the type system, basically to make it obvious at compile time that certain invariants were met. Right now, I'm also working on Hickory DNS. So they want to actually use Hickory DNS as the resolver for Let's Encrypt, because obviously for proving that the domain name is owned by someone, And there is the DNS method of doing that in the Acme protocol. And so they are very reliant on their DNS recursive resolver. And they want to replace their C-based one with Hickory DNS in the future. And so in order to do that, we have to make Hickory DNS more robust and implement a bunch of features that it didn't have yet.
So is there like a funding scheme where you get paid for every single abandonware / package with 1 million users that just has someone who wants to leave, whatever we want to call it, for those sorts of projects? Do you get like $1 per everything you maintain, or how does that work exactly?
No, definitely not. So what I do use is thanks.dev. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it is a tool that helps companies or organizations in general pay for their or sponsor their dependency graphs, and not just the direct dependencies, but also ideally the transitive dependencies. For better or for worse, a lot of the dependencies that I pick up tend to be really low level, small things. So they end up not being the thing you rely on directly often, but a thing that you rely on indirectly. So tooling that spreads the funding and the love over the whole dependency graph and not just the direct dependencies or the ones that are most salient or visible is really helpful to me. And so thanks.dev ends up having a little bit of impact on my revenues. It is nice. I also have GitHub sponsors, but it's more of a discovery problem, I guess.
That's interesting. Is thanks.dev a non-null part of your income at this point? Like it's a relevant part? Like it's really cool.
Especially for like some of the libraries that I end up maintaining have been around the block, have a long history. And so I just respond to pull requests, and some of the companies that pay into thanks.dev are using that stuff and paying for it.
That is awesome. That's really cool to hear. We had Ali Neshat on this podcast, the founder of thanks.dev. That was episode 148. Go check that out. I was a bit dubious because there's been a lot of sort of, hey, fund the whole stack. Back Your Stack was an early one. There's been a lot of these sort of mechanisms to try to spread out the love. And it's hard. It's hard because the low level packages are so low level that, you know, who maintains them and how do we get paid? So it's really good to hear that it's working for you and that it's just working in general. That makes me feel amazing.
Yeah. I mean, when you say it's working, it's like still a small part of real income, right? So it's not like when I pick up another abandoned dependency, that's not going to sustain me meaningfully. I just think it's the right thing to do. And given the other income sources that I have, I can, just sort of do it. But it's a start, and it would be great if that grows.
It's a start. I agree. Speaking of rising, Tidelift is another good example of.
I think I am subscribed to Tidelift. Like I have my stuff linked there, but I haven't seen any revenue from it. I think they were not big into the Rust ecosystem for a long time. And now I think they do sort of support it, but apparently none of the companies are using it with Rust or whatever, because otherwise I would probably see something show up.
That's actually really useful feedback. I was trying to explain to some undergraduates today in a lecture about how open source as a whole is actually divided into these different ecosystems, the JavaScript ecosystem, the Python ecosystem. And it's interesting to learn that some ecosystems in general may see more remuneration from these types of projects than others.
Yeah, I mean, the Rust ecosystem is relatively small, right? Compared to JavaScript or Python, it's much smaller. And so I imagine that for a company like Tidelift or an organization like Tidelift, it might not be as interesting to go after that sort of slice of the pie. But that means that for me, well, I think I've been on there like basically from the start, but I haven't seen any results.
Tim Ferriss often talks about his weird forays into the esoteric. And as a podcast host, I understand that myself, where I'm talking to maintainers and often they just really love focusing on this one small segment of the coding world. How did you get into memory safe languages and Rust? Like what happened?
So I did a startup. That was my first job in 2007. And we were building like a hedge fund. We had a bunch of funding from another hedge fund that wanted to curate basically a new approach or a new team. And I was a fan of Python at the time. And so I wrote a hedge fund startup in Python, all of it, a whole bunch of simulation strategies and then trading systems and interfaces, web-based interfaces for our trader. And I got frustrated both by the lack of feedback that you get from using Python. Well, so I wasn't using an IDE at the time. I was using Nano a lot, and that works for me, but might have not helped with this part. So it's really frustrating when you run some code and there are obvious mistakes, like you misspelled a variable name, things that computers should be able to do for you and aren't in that environment. And so that was just frustrating. And then also the performance angle, right? A lot of the code that I was writing wasn't using all of the dynamics that you can do with Python, but I was still paying for it with a zillion hash map lookups, basically, right? And so I was looking at the time for something that would solve these problems for me. I wasn't about to go start using C or C++ because, well, I think the manual memory management that you have to do, especially in C, is very error prone and leads to hard to debug problems. In C++, that part may be a little better, but there's death by 1,000 complexities in the type system or whatever. And so I actually started writing my own language. I wrote in Python a compiler for a language to LLVM bitcode and tried to do that because I thought that Rust was too complicated. And I also didn't like curly braces look of Rust. And then I figured out why Rust lifetimes needed to exist by sort of running into the same problem in my own compiler. And so I was like, oh, now I understand why we need the complexity. And then I was writing a OpenID Connect IDP, or wanted to write one. And someone was proposing writing one in Go, and I was not a fan of Go. And so I said, I'll write one in Rust. And it took me like 40 hours to get something barely functional going. And so that was like, well, this language works. I can get going pretty quickly. It's more robust than Go. I think it has a better type system and it's going to be performant. So this is pretty nice.
So it's been Rust all the way ever since.
Well, there was a whole bunch of like Python to dump, and it was hard at first to find jobs that let me do Rust, right? So I did it mostly in my free time, but over time it has improved, and now I can just do only Rust and phasing out the last bits of Python code out of my life.
When you say that it's been hard to find jobs in Rust, obviously right now you have jobs in Rust, but it seems to be the kind of jobs where you're paid because of Rust, right? As opposed to just I'm working and I'm using Rust as my tool. Does that sound accurate?
Right now, yes. I mean, before like a year ago, I was doing a startup. I was the CTO and we used Rust there, like more as the tool rather than in infrastructure because it was a good replacement for C. So I've done both. There's still like people saying that it's hard to write Rust either because of the learning curve or because it slows you down initially. And so proving out a proof of concept is maybe not the win that you think it might be because you spend more time up front. And I will say, I think it's worth it in terms of not having to find bugs later on in production.
I have a really dumb question, so bear with me on this one. When you say you take over projects and rewrite them, let's say there's a low-level Python project that's used by a lot of Python things. And if you rewrite it in Rust, does that slot in and replace that in the Python ecosystem? But is it still in the Python ecosystem? Or are you rewriting it and now it's only accessible in the Rust ecosystem? Is there a cross-ecosystem compatibility between rewritten components?
There can be. So I have, in fact, written a bunch of Python wrappers for Rust projects. So at my startup, I started out doing a segmentation library. So this is, I have a string of letters and I want to split it into words based on a dictionary of words and how frequently they are seen. And so we wanted to do that fast because we had a big domain library, in fact, that we wanted to do this for. And so I wrote that in Rust because that's the way to make it fast and safe. And then I wrote Python bindings for it, which is pretty easy. There's this project called Pyo3, which lets you write sort of pretty natural Rust code in a way that easily wraps around normal Rust code and then turns it into a Python library. And so that's pretty straightforward. And I've done that for like 3 or 4 more projects. So in fact, one of the things I did, I think last year, is that I wrote a wrapper for Rustls called Rustls, which provides a Python wrapper for Rustls as an alternative TLS implementation that's usable from Python.
The reason I ask that is when I think about abandonware, which again, is not a term we have to use. When I think about unloved projects that don't have a maintainer working on them, I often wonder whether that's because the ecosystem is dying or because their work is underappreciated or because it hasn't been ported to a different ecosystem that would be more interested in that usage. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what happens to those sorts of projects or why they end up in the perilous state they're in.
So I don't have experience with this much outside the Rust system, Rust ecosystem. I did do this once with a Python library. There was one called RNC to RNG, which converts like RelaxNG compact syntax to RelaxNG XML syntax. And there was an old package and I needed this. And so I started hacking on that and eventually got permission from the original author to take over like the PyPI registration. From what I've seen, like the packages I've taken over is mostly just people have worked on something that either now fulfills their purpose, so they are no longer motivated to work on it more, or just get busy with other stuff, right? Move to another job where they no longer need this stuff, or are generally too busy to work on it, get a family, have some life event or whatever that prevents them from spending as much time as they did before. And so that happens and it's totally okay. But it's sad, I think, for the effort invested in that package to fix the bugs or whatever. And for all its dependencies to have to find out that this is now deprecated. Now we have to find something else that might not be as good or has its own challenges. And so I think there is a lot to gain in terms of global value or like ecosystem value in just providing basic continuity for these low-level things.
Is there a bat symbol that we could put into the sky asking people to come help us out with our projects? Like, how do you find these projects that need help?
I mean, I find them because I need them, right? I have them in my dependency. And so recently I was like, we have in Rust, we have the advisory DB, we have the RustSec project, which maintains an advisory DB, which I'm now also helping maintain because there weren't enough maintainers. And there we also collect unmaintained advisories. So people will collect kind of like a bat signal, except it's more like to scare off people, right? If you have this in your dependency graph, you have to do something because you might not like what's going to happen next, I guess. And so recently there was at least one package that was pretty popular and it went unmaintained. And then I happened to know the author because I had previously taken over another package from them. And so they emailed me, hey, you did a good job with the other one. Want to take over this one as well? And so I did. So the advisory DB provides at least some way of finding and collecting deprecated stuff or like stuff that's no longer being maintained. Yeah, that's maybe part of a solution.
When I went to summer camp as a 10-year-old, there was a really fun sign on all the walls of the cabin. And to make sure we all listened, we had to learn this little song. Don't touch me, I may have rabies. If you see me, tell an adult. Which is our way of saying don't touch the bats if they fly into the cabin, right? I just had a fun time going through my head. Don't touch me, I may have rabies. If you see me, tell a maintainer. Because I'm just wondering, like, how do you see this symbol saying, I didn't have time for this project? And then how do you take it on? Like, what are you so good at that you don't get the rabies burnout of maintainer? How do you avoid that?
In a way, I guess I feel less invested or like don't take on the burden of proactively improving the project. So the role I see for myself is just, I will be there when someone submits a PR. I will look at the PR. If I don't like the PR, I will say so and try to tell you exactly what I don't like about it so you can improve it. And then if you do improve it along the lines that I like, then I will merge it and publish a new release. And so this feels to me like a relatively small burden, like depending on the amount of PR submissions that you get, of course. But like the burden is not that large to me. And so I think the cost-benefit ratio works out well there.
How do you deal with context switching? I always find it difficult when I'm looking at a repo I haven't looked at in a while where I see a PR and I'm like, oh, what does this code even do? You know?
Yeah, it's not a problem for me too much. One, I think because Rust, right, which has this wonderful type system and built-in support for unit tests and all that stuff. Good tooling. So I rely on that heavily. I have all the automatic lints enabled. I use CI jobs to check a bunch of things automatically on every PR submission. Rust has this property that once it compiles, it often just works. And so I'm not sure like the way I do this would work in another language, but I think for Rust it works okay. So the other thing that I do is I ask folks to make small changes. So we call this atomic commits, where you make a series of small commits that do one thing. So if you're refactoring, rename something, especially large mechanical changes like a rename or something that's sort of boring, then I will ask to put that in a separate commit. I can breeze through the mechanical boring commits because I trust that they sort of are boring. And then I can focus on the remaining work, which is often smallish or can even still be broken up in small parts. Like I believe that reviewing code is like super linear in the size of the commit that you're reviewing at a time. And so splitting up commits into smaller bits drastically improves the time taken to review.
Would you argue that there are some languages that are more maintainer safe as opposed to memory safe? It just makes it easier to maintain because of the type system, et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. And like Rust is that language. Like it's best at that. I think it's probably Swift maybe as well. I think Python, Ruby, JavaScript, not as much. TypeScript, maybe a little bit more. I haven't reviewed Go much, but I think it's also a little bit harder probably.
I think it's rude to put Python and JavaScript in the same sentence, but maybe that's just my scars showing. So.
Yes, I prefer strong typing over weak typing as well, but still. I think Python and JavaScript are closer together than Python and Rust, let's say.
If you're a researcher and you're listening to this podcast and you have research you can point me to about maintainability in the long haul for language ecosystems, I would love to hear it. Please let me know because this is actually really interesting to me. Let's talk about attack vectors. You just said that you glance over the boring commits. You trust that they're doing fine. Has that ever bitten you? Has that ever been a problem?
Not really. So when I say a glance, I still look at it, right? I'm not looking at it. It's just I can scroll past it. And because I have 10 years of scrolling by Rust code experience, I'm pretty efficient at it. I know what to look for. And if something looks odd, then I'll stop and think about it. But sort of the point of this process is don't make me think too much because that'll slow me down and be a bottleneck.
LeftPad was a famous incident in the JavaScript ecosystem where there was a maintainer who was tired. Someone emailed and said, yo, can I take this over? And he's like, yes, please, thank God. And gave it over. And then that person was a malicious actor and infected the package with malware and everything was really bad until it got fixed. When you email maintainers saying, hey, can I take this over? How do you not get caught as like being a LeftPadder? Like, what do you do besides being a non-bad actor to show that like, hey, I have the best interest at heart?
I just point to my GitHub, right? And say, look at all the packages that I already maintain. Look at some of the packages that I took over previously and have sort of flourished since then. I think that's all there is, right? You can see that I have a public profile and that there's a lot of stuff there and a lot of stuff going on. And you will have to trust, basically, that is a better solution than the current state where you're not paying any attention to it. It's not a great system, right? But I think that's what we got so far.
You talked earlier about advisory DB, which is underneath RustSec, and they figure out how to deal with these things. It's awesome to think of you as this lone stalwart champion out there saving packages that are going down. That's really cool. I like that image. But at the end of the day, you too will probably get tired of some of these packages and have to move them on. Do you see a 10-year plan where like you're going to hand over your packages to some sort of Rust council that deals with this sort of stuff? Or what's the long-term play here?
So I did recently also offboard one of my projects I started called Ascama, which was a template engine in Rust, or is a template engine in Rust. I had found some other maintainers for that, and they were not happy with my lack of responsiveness in their pull requests on that project. And so they forked at some point, and I decided to give them the project, and so they could reintegrate the fork, basically. And so I've done this with RNC to RNG as well. I've given it to another maintainer. In that case, I didn't know that maintainer as well. So I'm still watching the repository and sort of checking that they don't do anything weird to avoid like the left pad issue. So I don't have a grand plan, but as long as I can scale myself to just watching for submissions, and then if I don't have time, I'll just not merge new stuff or stuff that is too big to work on. I will still merge stuff that's small. So that's some value, I would say. And then if there's a repeat contributor that's making good changes, then I'll welcome them in and try to get them to contribute more so that there is less of a buzz factor. So some of the projects I've taken over, I have, in fact, there is now another maintainer as well. So I'm not the only maintainer. So that's obviously, I think that's the best solution over time, to recruit new maintainers and make sure that each project has more than one.
Dirkjan, you've mentioned all this awesome work that you do, and you've mentioned, hey, I offboard some things. What's your long-term thoughts around open source sustainability? Like, do you want to be doing the same work in 10 years? Do you want to move on to something else? Do you know?
So I like doing this work, but sometimes I think I would like to move slightly up the stack. I find myself both drawn to going lower in the stack, like towards the kernel, and up the stack towards like having good GUIs. I generally want it to be easier to make good software. And so far, I think like Rust is a good tool for that. So I'm focusing on making good software in Rust. And so I think all these libraries have to be in place to do that efficiently. So you can pick up these components and get to some domain like specific tool. I don't have a grand plan. Like there's some things that should be rewritten in Rust still. Like I want an open SSH replacement. I want to be able to write iOS apps in Rust fully, ideally. So these are some things that I'm thinking about. And so I don't know if I'll get there or when I'll get there, but those would be nice directions.
Do you ever pair program? That might be the closest word. I'm trying to imagine a world where you're at this point of the stack and there's someone who's lower in the stack who can help you out and can help you make the packages you want so you can do the thing you need to do. Or there's someone who's really good at GUIs higher in the stack and you work together to build out a scaffolding so you can do stuff. Is that a kind of work that happens in open source ecosystems where you sort of pair with other people in different places to get the diversity of packages you need?
So pairing, I associate with synchronicity, right? With being
it's the wrong term.
Yeah. And so I try to do everything asynchronously because that scales across the world and also makes me flexible in how I use my time. I am like looking at the Xylem project in Rust as they're working on GUIs. And so I've participated there a little bit. And they've sometimes asked me for help and I've tried to help them. So I do try to get involved with like other parts of the ecosystem to share my experience or assist with their goals and try to watch like for other people working in similar directions as the ones I'm interested in.
I guess I was trying to get at something when we think about a healthy ecosystem, because it seems like you have a pretty overarching view of what makes a healthy ecosystem because of the amount of time you've been around. You need diversity of people and interest, right? You need people who are interested in GUIs. You need people who are interested in kernels. Do you feel that diversity or those interests change over time in a way that's healthy or unhealthy for an ecosystem? What does it take for an ecosystem to be resilient, for a language to be resilient to aging or to changes in implementation?
I think Rust is just in this phase where it's rapidly expanding and people are trying to do all the things in Rust. And so it's different from other ecosystems that might be more mature and have like more maintenance over the long haul challenges. We have maintenance over the long haul challenges because all those people that brought up the initial set of libraries 5 to 10 years ago, like some of them have flamed out or have no longer have time to participate. So that's part of what I'm doing, is to try to help replace those people or like make sure we still capture the value of those packages. So for people who don't know, Rust is also very much about providing a stable basis. So the language release is every 6 weeks. So there's a lot of language releases, but the language has made a promise to never make incompatible changes except when necessary because some bug cannot be worked around. And then there are editions every 3 years that you have to opt into. And so I feel like the language provides a great platform for doing maintenance over the long haul because it provides the stability and there's a lot of tooling. So
it sounds like the ecosystem itself is building in the resilience to make sure that things aren't hard.
Rust was developed originally to build a browser in, right? To be at least to make it feasible to build Firefox on it or the Firefox engine Gecko. And so it's very much built or engineered for this sort of long-term maintenance and making things stable enough that you can build complicated stuff on top of it without it breaking. And I think it does a good job at that so far.
That's good to hear. It's hard for me on the outside. I haven't written much Rust at all, any really. But I remember 10 years ago sitting in cafes with other developers and they were like, rewrite it in Rust. And I'm like, rewrite it in what? Like, what is that? And so it's cool to hear that like, oh no, we're still doing the good work. And it sounds like you're a big part of that. So Dirkjan, we're running out of time on today's podcast. I really enjoy you coming on and talking about this with me. Where can people learn more about your efforts and about your thoughts?
Well, I'm on Mastodon and Blue Sky. I have a blog that I update rarely. And then I'm on GitHub doing all the things. So you can follow what I do there, I guess.
But don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight. Spotlight's where we highlight other people, project things that we think are just awesome or that need a bit of light shed on them. Traditionally, the host goes first. So my Spotlight today is going to be Alan Day. Alan is awesome. He is a board member for GNOME, and I've worked with him over the past 7 months or so. And I've been really impressed by his ability to be congenial and to just deal with other people that I found too difficult. I am a bit of a hothead. It may surprise you, oh listeners, but it's awesome to be with someone who's always like, well, maybe we could do it this way, and maybe we should reach out to them here. And that sort of leadership is often unrecognized in open source, but Alan's one of the people behind the scenes making sure that GNOME goes forward without making enemies. Just an amazing person. I'm just really grateful for Alan today, and I'll link to his blog in the show notes. You can find it on the GNOME Foundation's website as well. Dirkjan, what's your Spotlight?
So I wanted to talk briefly about Xylem, which is this interesting project to build GUIs in Rust. And they have done a lot of effort to make it very efficient and still also ergonomic to build good GUIs in Rust. And they've spent a lot of time on that already and still going strong. So I think that's an interesting project of people working on an entirely different aspect of things in Rust that I'm watching.
Thank you. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there's a few things you can do. First, you can go to podcast.sustainoss.org, and you can find the show notes and follow up with all the awesome links that we have mentioned here today. Secondly, you can go to our Open Collective on SustainOSS, so opencollective.com/SustainOSS, and donate to this project because this podcast is not free to make. And it'd be really awesome to have more of them. We're good for May because of GitHub paying for these maintainer ones. Thank you so much. But I would love to be able to keep doing this podcast on the regular once a week for all of you. That also requires you to tell your friends about it. If you've enjoyed this podcast, if you've enjoyed learning something, please talk about it. Share. Sharing is caring. Clicking is loving. I don't know, all the things. That'd be really, really cool. If you have any thoughts that you want to share with me or any of the hosts, go to podcast@sustainoss.org. That's our email. Feel free to send along your hate mail there or love mail. Don't ever say that phrase again, Richard. Don't worry, I won't. And you can also find us on all of the socials. And by all the socials, I mean the good ones. So Mastodon, Blue Sky, and I guess LinkedIn because professionals. But yeah, those would be really cool. Share it. Love it. And if you are using Rust, check out Dirkjan and read his stuff and, just use his work that you're probably already using without even thinking about it. Dirkjan, thank you so much again for coming on. Best of luck with everything. And thanks.
Thanks. This was fun.